What we're going to be talking about today is a data-driven look at the Mac threat landscape. For those of you who don't know, my name's Thomas Reed. I work for Malwarebytes, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about today has to do with the data that we've been collecting for the past 6 months on the Mac platform. So we are collecting anonymized threat data so we can start to see some interesting patterns in the kinds of things that we're detecting, what we're seeing a lot of, what we're not seeing a lot of, what we're seeing none of at all. So there are some really interesting things to learn from that data, and that's going to be a big topic of discussion for today. We aren't just going to talk about data, though. We will also go and look at some malware from this year, and I'll give you guys some things to look for so that you know what kinds of warning signs to look for in your fleet. So let's start out just looking at the top Mac malware. And you'll notice here, let's see, yeah, the slides are up there. Okay. You'll notice up there, there's one that's really at the top of the list, an order of magnitude higher than anything else, and that is PUP.CryptoMiner. And then everything else below that is, as you can see, the numbers fall off kind of fast. This does show you that as far as actual malware is concerned, there's not a huge amount being distributed right now. And really the vast majority of it is that fake file opener. So what is that? Let's take a look. So fake file opener is actually a detection. It detects a number of different apps that we've seen. And what these apps do is they sort of try to hijack legitimate system functionality for their purposes to scam the user. So what they do is any application can, inside of its info.plist file inside the application bundle, it can register to handle any number of file types. So a particular application can say, hey, I can handle the TXT extension. I can handle any file with that extension. And then that becomes one of your options for opening a text file. So what these apps will do is they'll actually have hundreds of file types that they register as being capable of opening. Literally just about every common file type you find on the Mac. And so what happens is when you try to open a file that you don't have on your system, that app will trigger, it'll open up, and it will do something to try to scam you. Now, normally if you open a file like that, you see this normal system dialog here. It lets you choose an application to open it with or go search the App Store. What some of these apps will actually do is instead, they'll show you this. And as you can see, it's mimicking the legitimate system functionality. There are some issues there, as you guys are all Mac guys, so you'll spot these. The choose application button it's a little wonky and it's grayed out, which it shouldn't be. And instead of searching the App Store, it says search the web. And what that button will do is take you to a scam website that will tell you, hey, you might be infected and that's why you can't open this document. Go download this. So these kinds of apps, they all sort of do this general same thing, and we detect these as malware, and this is the name we've given them. And that's by far the most prevalent malware we see. Next in line is FlexiSpy, which is a legit piece of spyware. It's marketed for things like monitoring your children or your employees or something like that. But interestingly, we have never once received any complaints from somebody saying, hey, you detected FlexiSpy by mistake. And yet this is our #2 malware detection. So, I think that speaks for how this is actually being used. If nobody's complaining about it, when we detect it, then they're happy it's gone. So, and then next in line was something called PPMiner. We'll actually talk about this one a little bit more in a little while, because this is new this year, so we'll talk about that when we get to 2018 malware. But this one is a crypto miner, and crypto miners are getting to be a lot more common these days on all platforms, as I'm sure you guys know. So next slide, actually we're going to talk about the top detections of adware and PUPs, or potentially unwanted programs. All right, let me hear, what do you guys think is the top detection? All right, for those watching this recording later, MacKeeper was the answer, and you are correct by a long shot. Since January, we are coming up on nearly 4 million detections of MacKeeper, and that is a definite order of magnitude above everything else we detect. And in fact, this is actually the largest detection of everything we detect. Some days, about half of our detections are MacKeeper. So this thing is really, really prevalent. So let's take a look at the top 3 here. Top, obviously, is MacKeeper, the app that all MacAdmins love to hate. I'm sure you guys, if those of you who are in the room don't know what it is, I'm sure someone around you can fill you in. But we see this a lot. We see this involved in a lot of these fake virus pop-ups that you see online. You're visiting some website and something comes up and says, hey, you're infected, or you may be infected. And for MacKeeper, it often is accompanied by their little catchphrase, clean your Mac from junk, which I've always found the grammar there not quite right. So we see these kinds of things a lot, and most people who get MacKeeper installed don't really want it there. We do get some complaints, though, from people who they're like, why are you removing this software? Are you just removing any antivirus software that's not yours? And generally, when we point them to our blog post on MacKeeper, that pretty well ends the conversation right there. They're like, oh. So next one in the line was Advanced Mac Cleaner. This is very similar to MacKeeper. It pretends to be an antivirus and a cleaning tool. Does a lot of the same things. This one is kind of interesting because although MacKeeper is still the most aggressively marketed and nobody's done anything at all about it, Apple still hasn't done anything about Advanced Mac Cleaner either, but Google has caught on. And so if you try to go to their website today in any browser that uses Google Safe Browsing, it will not let you go there unless you work hard to get past this. So that's a very good thing, and it's probably the reason that this is only number 2 and not a little closer to MacKeeper in terms of detections. We see this a lot in the same kinds of cases. We see a lot of these fake virus pop-ups that are promoting Advanced Mac Cleaner instead of MacKeeper. So a lot of the similar ways of transmission. And then the next one, which was further down on the list, but it's still number 3, is PUP.JDI. And that's sort of a general grouping of a number of different programs by a company called JDI. And their programs are in 2 different categories. They have a whole bunch of clones of backup software. They're all basically the same, but they're all marketed differently. They all have different names, so they're pretending they're different pieces of software, and they don't really say this is from JDI. It's sort of almost like they're different competing products, but they're not. And ZipCloud in particular, at one point, about 50% of the adware installers we came across were installing ZipCloud. So this stuff's bad news, and if any of your users are using these for backups, they really shouldn't be. I would not trust any data to this company. The other side of their software is fake antivirus. All of their antivirus products, so far, they only have 2 of them. They require you to purchase before they will do anything at all, so there's no way to evaluate them. And then if you actually do purchase them, they really don't do a very good job. So we detect all these programs as PUP.JDI. So let's look at another category now. We talked about Advanced Mac Cleaner. That's made by a company called PCVARK. And here's a list of most of their stuff and how we're detecting it. And you can see here, as with pretty much every other category, we have one big outlier at the top, and that's Advanced Mac Cleaner. That's their #1 product. And then below that, there are a whole bunch of other things. And you'll notice here, if you look at some of the ads, there are things like Mac Ads Cleaner, Mac Adware Cleaner, Unpollute My Mac, Malware Crusher, Disk Cleanup Pro, etc. So they have a whole bunch of these different scammy antivirus/cleaning programs that are all junk, and they promote these very aggressively. These are often found in things like these fake Adobe Flash Player installers. Some of these are pretty nasty, and they have a variety of different tools. They have, as I said, a lot of them are cleaning tools, supposedly. They have a lot of junk apps that are found in the App Store and that are still found in the App Store. They have several apps designed to scrub porn from your browser history. If you're into that sort of thing, I don't know why you wouldn't just use private mode or then clear the history yourself. Why do you need to trust some app to do it? I don't know who would do that, but some people do. And like I said, these are promoted through these, You're Infected pop-ups and through fake Adobe Flash Player installers. Another category of things that we see a lot of in our detections are keyloggers. Now, when I'm talking about keyloggers in this case, I mean so-called legitimate keyloggers that you can actually go to a website and buy. These are not malware that has keylogging capabilities. If it was actual malware with keylogging capabilities, we would detect that as malware. These are all PUP keyloggers. And as you can see, once again, we have one clear outlier at the very top of the list, and that's Refog, which is a very popular keylogger right now. I was actually kind of surprised that this wasn't Aobo, because that was a number of years ago, that was a very popular one, but evidently not so much anymore. So Refog is it right now. It is primarily marketed for monitoring your children. We do see a large number of detections of this. And just like with FlexiSpy, which we actually detect as malware because of a variety of different reasons, we have had absolutely no complaints about detections of Refog. So, once again, this tells you people who have this on their computers and that are detecting it and having it removed, it's because they didn't know it was there. It's not that they were actually using it to monitor their children and then Malwarebytes removed it and they're like, oh, okay. People would complain about that. So that's not what it's actually being used for in the wild. It's being used for much creepier purposes like monitoring, significant others or, who knows who else. So another interesting one here, ransomware has been a big buzzword in the Windows world, at least. It's starting to slack off a little bit in favor of cryptominers these days, but it's really interesting. We've had some ransomware on the Mac. but it really hasn't been significant, and we really aren't detecting any these days. Now you'll notice, I say we aren't detecting any, but you'll notice that there is a bar there for KeyRanger. That is the first and oldest piece of ransomware for the Mac. It's been extinct for a while. It doesn't actually function properly anymore because it can't connect to its servers. So I do not believe that this bar actually represents in the wild detections. My theory on that is that this is somebody's testing, that somebody is doing testing with Malwarebytes against KeyRanger, and that's where these detections are coming from. And that makes sense because the other two are fairly obscure, whereas KeyRanger is, it was a little bit higher profile at the time, and it's probably the easiest one to find if you wanted to do some testing. So for all practical purposes, we really don't see any real ransomware out there. We do see a lot of coin miners, though, as in the Windows world. So we have on our list 6 different categories that are crypto miners. You'll notice that the top one there is actually not, we don't consider that one malware, we're calling that one a PUP. So let's take a look at what that actually is. The PUP.CryptoMiner is sort of a general category for any kind of applications that are doing crypto mining in kind of a sneaky way, but they're not outright malicious. So some things that will get them detected are if they're doing crypto mining, but they have not informed the user in any clear way that they're doing crypto mining. You know, maybe it's hidden in some fine print somewhere, but not anywhere the user can see it. Or if they don't give the user an opt-out, you know, so you're having the crypto mining going on, but there's no way that you can stop it if you wanted to. You know, so for example, some apps or websites might actually say, hey, you know, you can choose to either have ads or crypto mining. Which would you like? And you know, if the user chooses crypto mining, that's fine. You know, we don't have a problem with that, just as long as they know what's happening. The other thing that we don't like is when, you know, and this is even if they're doing everything else right, if they're using all of your processor time for the mining, you know, literally there's no way to dial it down, then that's a problem. And a lot of times what we see is that when the user sees this process using all their processor time, they don't actually know what it is, they don't know why it's using that processor time. So even if the app is saying, hey, we're doing mining, we know users don't like to read. They just say, yeah, where's the OK button? Click. So, and then later they find out, hey, why is my machine so slow? You know, I don't know what's going on there, and they don't remember about this program they installed. So that's a problem. So one example of an app that was doing it wrong, and this was actually in the news not very long ago, was the Calendar 2 app that was in the App Store. And it was doing basically all of these things wrong. It really didn't tell the user, and it was using all the processor power. And so we detect that. Fortunately, they did remove all the crypto mining code from that app at this point, so it is no longer doing this, which is good. What's interesting is that Apple has subsequently banned all crypto mining from the App Store, and we believe this app is probably the reason why. Speaking of the App Store, we see a lot of PUPs in the App Store. And you can see, you know, these are some of the top detections here. A lot of these actually are from PCVARK, but not all of them by any means. So PCVARK is highly represented, but there are many, many other companies making PUPs. There are generally 2 categories of PUPs in the Mac App Store, and those are fake or ineffective antivirus or anti-adware programs. If you go on the Mac App Store right now and search for adware, you'll find a bunch of these. And basically what these do, a lot of the anti-adware programs, all they will do is basically delete all of your browser extensions regardless of whether they're good or bad, and then just blast your browser settings back to ground zero. So it's basically a nuke and pave, and oh look, your problem went away. And users fall for it. And they're like, yeah, my problem did go away. Now, why is my homepage changed, and where did my 1Password extension go? And they don't associate those two things. They just know their adware problem got solved. Or maybe it didn't, because not all adware problems have a browser extension as the root cause. So, and then as far as antivirus, most of these really don't do a very good job. What a lot of them are doing to get around any kind of technicalities is they're integrating the ClamAV engine. And this is not ClamXAV, which is a legitimate Mac antivirus. The guy that manages that, I know him, he's a good guy, he does good work, and it does have Mac signatures. The ClamAV engine does not have Mac signatures, at least not many to speak of. So if you're Mac antivirus and all you're doing is incorporating the ClamAV engine, you're really not Mac antivirus. And some of these apps have been removed. So when we find these things, we report them to Apple. We report them to security at Apple. And some of them have been removed. In some cases, it often will take a long time, sometimes as long as 6 months. There was one particular antivirus app that was really, really bad, and it took Apple 6 months to remove it. Unfortunately, that's not the worst news. 6 months sounds bad, but some of these things that we've reported to Apple have never been removed. There is one particular app by a very prominent major antivirus company. I'm not going to name them because we don't have legal clearance to do so yet. But there is an app by them in the App Store that is currently taking your browser history for Chrome, Firefox, and Safari, and for the App Store itself, putting it in a zip file and sending that up to a server that is it's definitely on that antivirus company's domain. So it's not something that's from somebody else that's pretending to be from that antivirus company. It's actually going to their domain. And we reported this to Apple, and so far nothing has happened. So we're still trying to figure out what the right way is to report this to Apple, because it's really not clear. There's no easy, clear method for doing so. And that in itself is a big problem. So until Apple gets their procedures together for this is going to be a continuing problem, and the App Store really is not trustworthy. All right, so that's an interesting look at some of the different categories of things we're detecting. I know you guys probably want to find out what malware is in the wild in 2018, what's new, and how do you see it, how do you spot it, how do you identify it. So let's take a look at what some of this stuff is and what some of the IOCs are, or if you're not familiar with security lingo, IOCs are indicators of compromise. They're things you can look for to identify that a particular system has been compromised. So the first one found in 2018 was Mommy. This one was actually first reported by a user on the Malwarebytes forums, but Patrick Wardle beat us to finding the sample. So Patrick Wardle, he's got a really good blog post on this thing. He did the analysis on it initially. It is still currently unknown how it got installed. We were never actually able to get an answer from that. About that from the user on our forums. He did not know how it got there. But however it gets on the system, there are a few things that it does. The first thing is that it installs a launch daemon. with a fairly lengthy script. Now, it's not like huge, but it's definitely unusual for a launch agent or a launch daemon. And what that script does is it downloads and executes a malicious file, and that file actually changes the DNS server settings to use a malicious DNS server. So that opens up all kinds of problems. It can do phishing or any other kind of attacks where it's redirecting you to a malicious domain and you think you're on the real thing. It also had some general purpose backdoor code. Patrick did say that he could not manage to make that code get called. He couldn't figure out how to make that code active, but it is there. So, it's entirely possible that during his analysis, he was not actually passing the right parameters somehow that the dropper would have done. And so that code wasn't active. Now, as far as indicators of compromise, the two DNS servers are listed here. And by the way, you don't have to actually take notes here. I will give you a link at the end of the presentation for these slides so you can download it. Yes? What?
I think you're a slide off. I'm sorry.
Oh, yes I am. Yes I am. There we go. DNS servers. Anyway, you will be able to get these slides and get all this data out of the slides. So the DNS servers are listed there. The payload itself would be downloaded from a variety of different servers. These are the ones that we know of. And it would also, interestingly, add a trusted root certificate from CloudGuard.me. That also needs to be removed. That should not be in there. And what that would allow is that would help with any phishing attempt. So if they're directing you away from, say you're trying to go to bankofamerica.com, and instead they direct you to a phishing site pretending to be bankofamerica.com, but maybe they don't have a good certificate for that. Well, if they can get this certificate put in as a trusted root certificate on your system, then suddenly they can make it look legit. And that makes their phishing attack look even better. So you want to look out for all of these things. If you see any of this kind of stuff, any of those network connections on your network, or see any of your machines with this particular certificate, you've got an infection. The other thing to look for are the launch daemons. Now, unfortunately, you can't look for these by name. It did use random names. So what you have to look for is the content of the launch daemon. And this is sort of an excerpt. I did snip out some of the stuff. So you'll notice there it lists two different fallback URLs. Those are the two URLs that it will try to download the malicious executable from. And the part that I snipped out, there was a very lengthy bit of data, encoded data, that I'm not sure exactly what was encoded in that data, but it was passed to the URL. It probably had some kind of parameters about the machine itself that it was being installed on. And so you can see here what it would do is it would make this list of these two URLs, and then it would try to, it would use curl to try to download a file from there, and then it would execute it. And so that way, every time you restart your computer, this is actually going out and grabbing a new copy of this malware, an updated copy, and pulling it back down onto your hard drive. So if you see unusually large launch daemons, or if you see any of this content inside of a launch daemon, you've got an infection on that machine. And we have seen only 72 cases of this malware since its discovery in January. So it's not hugely prevalent. It is out there, but it's not hugely prevalent. The next one, this was the second one discovered in 2018, this year, is Crossrat. And this was, it's a government rat or remote access tool. It's thought to be from the Lebanese government, but I'm always a little bit iffy about trusting attributions like that. A lot of malware authors these days are laying down false trails. It's the thing that makes me more, believe this is, why would you lay down a false trail to the Lebanese government? The popular target today is either China or Russia. If you're making malware and you want to throw off the investigation, you make it look like it's coming from China or Russia, and then everybody's like, oh, look at this new Russian malware. And you're like, so, but this was analyzed by Lookout. They called it Dark Caracal, the whole class of government malware. And Crossrat was just a part of it. And this was the only part that was able to actually infect a Mac. The reason it was able to infect a Mac is that it used Java, which is lame. I mean, how many of you guys have Java on any of the machines in your fleets? Oh, interesting. That is not what I would have expected. Yeah, that's a good question. Probably not happy about that. Yeah, but a lot of consumers don't have Java. Macs have not had Java installed by default in many years. There aren't very many websites out there that use Java. So, barring things like internal tools, which I'm guessing that's probably one reason you guys all have that. Stuff like that, yep, SPSS. So barring stuff like that, you're not going to see Java on Macs very much these days. And another interesting thing about this is that it was a version 0.1. So it was very early in development, and a lot of its functionality really wasn't there yet. We don't know if this is continuing to be developed or not. It's entirely possible that they could say, oh, it was spotted, it was spotted by somebody, we're going to drop this and start working on something new that nobody knows about. So we don't know. If you have been infected with this, it's actually quite easy to spot. You will have this launch agent and this Java executable. The names don't change, the content doesn't change. It's very, very easy to spot. So if you have either one of these things present, you're infected with Crossrat. Now, that's fortunately very, very unlikely because we've only seen 13 cases of this ever since it was first discovered. So this is pretty uncommon. It's not likely any of you guys have this in your fleets. The next one is actually a CryptoMiner. This was the first new CryptoMiner this year, and it's called CreativeUpdate. This one was actually discovered by a guy, a former Intego employee. He was up until recently working for SentinelOne. His name is Arnaud Abati, if I'm saying that right. I don't know, I've never met him face to face. But he's discovered actually quite a few CryptoMiners on the Mac. This one was kind of interesting because it was distributed via a hack of MacUpdate. So what happened is that somebody managed to get into MacUpdate and they replaced several different applications. So instead of when you tried to download from MacUpdate, it would actually redirect you to a download from a different site. And you wouldn't know because all you got was just the download. It looked like it was downloading the right thing from MacUpdate. And the three apps that we know were affected were Firefox, Onyx, and something called Deeper that I had never heard of before this. I don't know why those apps were chosen. I mean, Firefox is obvious, but I don't know about the other two. We don't actually know if there might have been other apps affected. I don't know that I necessarily really trust Mac update these days. They've had some problems. For example, at one point in the past, they were distributing adware installers. They actually wrapped our software in their installer at one point, which we had to ask them to stop doing. And they were a little resistant, so I don't necessarily trust them. So I'm not 100% certain that these are the only 3 apps that were affected. But these apps were infected. What would happen when you downloaded them is they would look and act perfectly normal, but they would also install this malware on your system. And it's become a fairly common thing to happen. That happened with KeyRanger. Handbrake was compromised, and the Handbrake app would deliver KeyRanger. There have been a number of other pieces of malware that have done the same thing. So these kinds of supply chain attacks are definitely increasing in commonness these days. Interestingly, when we look back, we did what's called a retro hunt in VirusTotal, which is where you can go back in VirusTotal and look through samples, older samples, and see if anything matches the criteria you're giving. And we found a whole bunch of samples that went all the way back to October of last year. So this has been around for a while. It didn't just appear this year. It was just this particular delivery mechanism was new. And interestingly, all of these were all downloading their updates from public.adobecc.com, which is a legitimate Adobe site. So they were abusing an Adobe site for delivering their updates. If you were infected, if you had any machines that were infected by any variant of this, there are a variety of different launch agents that could be created and different executable files that would be in your library. And this is the comprehensive list of every single one that we found from every different variant. Most of them used the same ones, but some branched out a little. And interestingly, there was some kind of, there was some sneakiness here. So for example, MD Worker, if you go out online and look for stuff relating to MD Worker, you're going to find a lot of Spotlight-related issues. So if a user sees this using a lot of processor power, they're going to go looking and they're going to find a lot of solutions relating to Spotlight. And all these solutions are going to be things like, rebuild your Spotlight indices and things like that. And, makes it look like it's a legitimate, real problem, not malware on your system. So that was kind of sneaky. That was a very good naming convention that these folks came up with. So how is this being detected? We've seen 187 cases of this since it was first discovered. So not a huge number, but it's definitely higher than anything else we've talked about so far, in the malware space at least. So let's see what else we've seen. Coldroot was the next one discovered. This one was a general purpose rat or backdoor, whatever you want to call it. And this one was one of these is disguised as a document. So, you get this thing, it looks like a Word document. You double click it to open it, and it turns out it's actually an application. There are a lot of safeguards built into macOS to prevent that sort of thing. But there are also ways around some of those safeguards. So we don't know exactly how this was distributed, but there are ways that it could have gotten onto your system, and you double click it and you would not see the typical macOS, you're opening an application downloaded from the internet prompt. It would just pop open, everything would look normal, you'd get no gatekeeper notifications, no xprotect, no nothing, and the malware's running. So it just depends on how this was delivered, how it got onto the user's system. Now, interestingly, this one was a little less dangerous because it won't run on some versions of macOS for a variety of reasons, some involving bugs. And it will also attempt to modify the tcc.db database. This is the database that controls accessibility rights for applications. So if an application wants to control some aspect of your computer, then it has to actually get user approval for that these days. In some versions of macOS, you were able to actually manually change this database and add your applications in there. So you didn't actually have to alert the user, you could just sort of steal the rights. That database has actually been protected by SIP, System Integrity Protection, for a while now. So this didn't work either unless you're on an older version of macOS. If you did have an older version of macOS and you had this infection, it's really easy to spot. You just have one launch daemon by a static name and one executable also by a static name. And this uses a pretty common technique of making this look like it's coming from Apple, using this com.apple naming convention. But you guys are probably pretty familiar with what Apple launch agents and daemons should be present. So for some folks like you guys, it's easy to spot. For an average user, not so much. So since this was first spotted in the wild, we have only seen 7 cases. So really hasn't affected very many people. And I find it interesting that it's really infected any at all. It really had a lot of very significant limitations. So I kind of would expect this to be a low detection rate. The next one is actually OceanLotus.D. And that .D means this is, by somebody's naming convention, the 4th variant of OceanLotus. OceanLotus was actually first discovered, the first variant of it, back in 2014 or 15, I believe. So it's been around for a while. At one point we thought it was extinct, and then of course a new variant popped up. And it has typically been used to attack Chinese targets. So we don't typically see it very much in this country. But this particular variant was dropped by macros in a Word document. So you open up the Word document, and if you enable macros and allow them to run, then it will drop some files on your hard drive. Now, there's a lot of user interaction required there. The user has to do that, enable that. But in addition, modern versions of Office, they actually sandbox all macros. So if you run this macro in a modern version of Office, it actually won't allow the creation of those files on your hard drive. So if you're using the latest version of Office, you're totally safe from this. It cannot infect you. Even if the user does the dumbest thing possible and goes through all the steps needed to run the macros can't drop the payload. So there's a narrow range of versions of Office that have macros but haven't been sandboxed yet, and in that narrow range you could get infected. Interestingly, there were alternate root and non-root payloads. Now, I have no idea how you would get the root payload. I don't know how you would get root access with this particular delivery mechanism. We couldn't duplicate that, so, but I know the malware had a capability to drop a root payload. So here's what it actually dropped. So if you're looking at root access, however it might have gotten it, I don't know. Maybe the user was running as root, had enabled the root user and was opening Word documents in the root user. I don't know. It would drop a launch daemon, com.apple again, you'll notice. So good to trick the average user with. And the executable is buried way down in this obscure folder. This folder actually does exist up to a certain point. This path does exist up to a certain point. So it's This again looks kind of normal. If you did not have root permissions, which is going to be the more normal scenario, then it would drop a user launch agent, com.apple.spell.agent, and it would also drop this spell agent D file into the spelling folder. Again, that spelling folder exists in the user library already, so that's perfectly legit. Spell agent D does not. But they used a good naming convention there. You know, Apple's processes all end in D, so if you're malware, you make some, you know, real sounding thing and put a D at the end of it. And we have only seen 2 detections of this, which is as I would expect, since the method of delivery has so many limitations attached to it. If you look at our overall OceanLotus detections, we've seen 151 since January when we started collecting data. So only 2 out of 151. This really is not a prevalent variant. Then the next one is PPMiner. This one is a CryptoMiner. This one was actually one. It was brought up on Apple's forums. We spotted it, we found it, analyzed it, etc. The reason that it was spotted is the user, actually it was several users, noticed this process called MS Helper that was using a lot of processor power on their machines, and they were trying to figure out what it was. And obviously that sounds like something associated with Microsoft Office. So it sounded kind of legit. They were, you know, approaching this not from a perspective of, you know, hey, I think I'm infected, but hey, what's wrong here? And this is a very simplistic CryptoMiner. All of the CryptoMiners, incidentally, that we've seen lately, all mine Monero rather than something else like Bitcoin. That's a very common one. So. We do not know how this was distributed. We just know what ends up on the user's machine. So we don't know how it got there. Interestingly, the malware itself was compiled with Golang, which there's huge overhead there. And the malware itself is very, very simple. So this is most likely some script kiddie who figured out how to, you know, wrap some CryptoMiner up in Golang and compile it, and, you know, so it's not very sophisticated. And the basic chain here is there's a launch daemon that loads a launcher, which in turn loads the miner. So let's take a look here. The launch daemon is actually called com.pplauncher.plist. Again, not very sophisticated. This is not a name that sounds legitimate. You know, they didn't use com.apple. They were using MS Helper. Why didn't they call it com.microsoft? You know, that would have sounded more real. So this is kind of an unsophisticated name. It's not really trying to hide that hard. And what that would do is it would launch the launcher, which was called PP Launcher, hidden away in application support. Again, not very well hidden. You know, it wasn't in a hidden folder. It wasn't named anything sneaky. You know, so it's not very well hidden. And PP Launcher, which was the component that was built with Golang, its sole purpose was to launch MS Helper with the proper arguments. MS Helper was actually built from a legitimate open source mining tool. So it in and of itself is not necessarily malicious. It's not malware. But installed in this location, you know it's associated with that malware. So if you see this MS Helper, that's your sign of trouble. Now, as far as how we've detected this one, it's definitely the most highly detected piece of malware from this year, 863 cases. So probably more than that by now, because this data is probably about a week old. The last one that we'll talk about today is Dummy, and there are some good reasons for this name too. So this was one, it was again another one that's discovered by Patrick Wardle. I'm sorry, it wasn't actually discovered by Patrick Wardle, it was discovered by somebody else and then subsequently analyzed further by Patrick Wardle. The original discoverer didn't give it a name, he just said, hey, here's this thing and here's what it's doing. So Patrick Wardle was the one who gave it the name Dummy. This one actually was being spread via a shell script that was pasted into crypto mining forums on Slack and Discord. So basically, people that were posing as admins were posting this script and saying, hey, copy this and paste it into the terminal and see if this solves the problem you're having with your miner. You can see here, there's an example that was actually posted in Discord, and this was how they were convincing the user to do this. So this script basically, it does cd temp, so it changes to the temporary directory. It does curl from a malicious URL, which is blacked out here. And then gives it executable permissions and then runs it. And I mean, why would you run this? Why would you do this? And yet people will. We'll actually talk about that in a minute. And so what this malware does is very simple. All it does is provides reverse shell. So basically, the person behind it can get into that machine at any time via SSH, and once you're in with SSH, you've got total control over the machine. You can do whatever you want. You can upload any files, execute any files, exfiltrate any files, whatever you want to do. Now, one interesting thing that it does, it actually leaves a couple files on the hard drive with the user's password in it. Now, how does that happen? The script file that gets downloaded and executed actually imitates sudo. So even though this pasted script doesn't have sudo in there anywhere, after you execute the script, it will say password, just like sudo would. And you type your password and nothing appears on the screen, just like sudo would. So the users type in their password, the malware logs it in plain text into a couple different files so that it has it for later, and then proceeds to do its dirty work. And that's got some big implications too that we'll talk about in just a minute. So if you see an infection, this is what you're going to see. So the script itself that gets downloaded by that shell script, it's in temp/script. And that's a big file. It's like a 34 megabyte file. This was JavaScript code that was wrapped in Google V8. So it was, yeah, like, why? Why not just make it an AppleScript applet or something like that? You know, this is script kiddie stuff. Then the launch daemon, again, this is not very sneaky, com.startup.plist. I mean, come on guys, use com.apple or something that makes it look legitimate. And then that launch daemon will launch the persisted shell script, which is put in /var/root/script.sh. And that script was very short, and basically all it did was open up a reverse shell. If you want to actually see what that script looks like, Patrick Wardle's analysis is very good, and it's got the full script listed there. Also, I think I included that script in our analysis too, on our blog. And then the two files that contain the user's password in clear text are located here, one in users shared and one in temp. And then finally, the reverse shell is going through a remote host here. There's the IP address, and the port 1337. More script kiddie stuff, right? So there, as you can see, the password files, they're called dump.dummy. So yet another reason to call this dummy, but that's only one of many reasons to call this dummy. So the name is very appropriate. Now, before I talk further about this, number of detections since discovery, 0. We have not seen this in the wild at all, and that does not surprise me at all. Although, if we had seen a few, that also would not surprise me for one big reason. So when I said that, people put a script out on a forum and said, hey, copy this and paste it in to the terminal, everybody laughed, right? But people do that all the time. So I'm going to give you an example. I used to be very, very active on Apple's forums. I haven't had time to be active there lately, but I used to be really, really active there. I've been on Apple's forums for more than 10 years now. There was this guy. He was also very, very active on Apple's forums. And he would go around and he would tell people, hey, run this script and then post the output here. His actual post was much longer than that, very long, but that was the gist of it. And what you would see is you would see this one line, but you could see there was a scroll bar under it. And if you scroll, you could keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. This thing was tens of thousands of characters long. If you download it and put it into a text editor, you would not be able to read it because it was highly obfuscated bash script. I'm not like a bash guru, but I know how to read a bash script. And I had no idea what this thing was doing. And thousands upon thousands of people on Apple's forums have copied that script, pasted it into the terminal, run it, and then posted the output onto the forums. So people do this. As stupid as it is, people do this, and they do this all the time. So this is probably the big takeaway from this malware for you guys is user education. This is critical. You've got to make sure your users do not do this kind of stupid stuff. If they see a shell script on a website, you should make sure that they all know, do not paste this in. Sometimes it's really a helpful user who's trying to do good, trying to help you with something, but they don't know that. So the only scripts that should be run should come from you guys, not from some random website, some stranger somewhere. The other thing that is interesting about this malware is that dump.dummy file. This is not actually the first malware that has left behind a plain text password. There has been other malware in the past that has phished the password from the user and left it behind somewhere on the hard drive. But if I were a malware creator, and I tend to be a little sneakier than a lot of the malware creators that we actually see, like the actual malware in the wild, I always think, I could do better. But if I were doing this, I would go looking for those dump.dummy files. I'd say, hey, this person might have been infected by malware before. If they're running my malware, they might have run somebody else's before. So I'd go look for that dump.dummy file, or one of the files created by any number of other pieces of malware in the past. These are known files. They've been mentioned in analysis before. Their locations and names are known. The contents are known. So if you're malware, why don't you go and look for these files? And then you don't have to bother phishing a password from the user. You don't have to worry about trying to find some, root escalation vulnerability. You've got plain text passwords. Just go find them and use them. And I haven't figured out why no malware has done that yet. But it is very, very important that you guys look for these files on your endpoints and make sure that they are gone. So if somebody has been infected with this malware in the past, get rid of these files. And the problem is most antivirus software will not look for something like this. It will look for the executable file, and it'll remove that, and then the malware is dead, right? But the launch agent or daemon is probably still present, which in it itself, it's not really a danger, but it's kind of clutter. But more importantly, those password files aren't being detected because they don't contain any malicious code. So you got to make sure you get those. You got to make sure that for any malware like this, you go back and you look for those password files and get rid of them. Fortunately, Malwarebytes, if you're running it, it will look for these files and get rid of them. Not meaning to be a plug for Malwarebytes, I'm sure that there are other programs out there that will do the same thing. I'm just saying that use something or look for it yourself. Use something like OS Query to go looking for these files, because you definitely don't want plain text passwords sitting on your hard drives. And that is it. We're ready for questions. If you want to copy the slides, you can get them from there. I am not rickrolling you like has been done in a previous presentation. If I'm going to rickroll you, it's going to be a little sneakier. You'll have to work for it. So this is a legitimate URL. It will go to my Dropbox link for this file. But yeah, any questions now? Yeah. I can't hear. I don't think, is that on or, sorry. No. I hear it now.
First try.
There we go.
Have you noticed any similarities with a lot of these samples that you're getting from machines between like machine types or locations, maybe the type of person that's downloading them, or any of those things other than we had 50, 80 samples this year so far?
We don't really collect specific data about the machine, not very significantly. So we're not tracking that sort of stuff. It would be very interesting to see, but we try to make sure that this data is anonymized, and we don't want to track it back to the user. We don't, so we're not seeing those sort of trends right now. But if we can make sure that we can get that data anonymously in the future, then maybe.
First, Tom, thank you so much for this. This is wonderful. Sure. Excellent work. Second, I'm pleased that my user base has helped populate your antivirus database. So you're welcome. You're welcome. Third, more seriously, regarding all the PUPs that are in the App Store,
yep.
Do you recommend, or do you think it would help if more of us reported this to Apple?
Absolutely. The problem is I don't really know how. I've been reporting to product security, but I have the feeling that the chain between product security and the guys who are in charge of the App Store is not a straight and short one. So I'm still trying to figure out what the right way of doing this is. If you have an SE or somebody like that, definitely let them know if you see weird stuff on the App Store. Anybody at Apple that let them know about this stuff, because the more people we tell at Apple, the more chance there is that something will be done about it. And it really is an epidemic problem right now. In certain categories of software, you can really barely trust anything.
Sorry, I know there'd be some security issues with this, but I was wondering if anyone's ever tried to find a way to actually scan for a clear text password. If you could do a non-reversible hash and look for the
That's-
string?
Yeah, that's
Just so to even see if someone's keeping it in a text file somewhere?
yeah. That's actually a very interesting idea. You would probably, if you wanted to do something like that, you would probably want your users to be involved, because you guys don't want to know your users' passwords. That puts a lot of responsibility on you. If you have those passwords somewhere in clear text, then that puts a lot of responsibility on you. On the other hand, giving your users an app that's going to say, hey, what's your password, is another problem. There might be a good way to do it with enough user education, but I don't know. It would definitely be interesting if you could have some kind of a script that your users knew was legitimate and they could use it to check and see if their password was stored somewhere on their hard drive in clear text. It's just the logistics of figuring out how to do that on scale are kind of difficult.
So you had mentioned Mac Update and installing extra adware along with the installers. I know that there's a couple of other sites that will do similar things. I think Softpedia and a few others. Is there a good list of places that are known to do this so that we can maybe block them?
Yeah, the problem with the list is that it does change. Like Mac Update's not doing it anymore. They used to do it. And before they started doing it, then they weren't doing it. You know, so this does change quite a bit. My general advice is avoid all of these aggregation sites. So download.com, Softpedia, Softonic, Mac Update, any of these kinds of sites that are offering you, the ability to search apps and then download them right from their site, avoid it. Or if you want to use it, because sometimes, we'll be honest, the reviews can be useful sometimes. And sometimes it's just sort of a nice place to go to get, to look at a lot of different apps. But once you've looked and once you've made a choice and you say, okay, I want to download this app, don't get it from there. Go find the developer's website and get it directly from the developer. That's not a guarantee, because there have been cases in the past, numerous times, where the developer's website has gotten hacked. But that's pretty rare, so it's not a huge danger. It's always safer to get it straight from the developer than from one of these software aggregation sites.
Just one other little question. When you were saying we found so many instances of this malware PUP, did you mean like individual computers, institutions, or what's the?
Yeah, that's actual devices. So that's the number of computers that we found any trace of one of these things on, even if it was just like a launch daemon or a launch agent or something. So any trace would trigger it, on a particular machine. That would count as one machine, one device that was detected.
Wow.
Yeah.
Know your product better, but do users have the option to opt out of that reporting if they so
do,
choose? And so,
yes.
so do you have any idea what the appropriate level of inflation would be to get an actual number of
I
infections in the
actually
wild?
don't know. We are not tracking currently how many people have opted out, and I don't know if we ever will, because I mean, tracking the opt-out, I don't know. So we don't really know, but we do know that there is definitely some inflation in the numbers, that the real numbers. These numbers are actually a little lower than what would be if we didn't do opt-out.
So for education, probably a lot of people who are in education use certain discount websites that provide for that. I found that MacKeeper was sold in our university supported discount education site right alongside Adobe products and Microsoft products, and
Wow.
just came upon, happened to come upon that, and immediately we were able to get it pulled. But you may want to check that if you have these discount websites or discount software websites that look as if the university is endorsing that. And
Yeah, that's an excellent
then
point.
printed out a nice big thing at our help desk and say, with the nice logo, the robot on there, and said, "Do not install this crap."
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if you see that, I would definitely get as many people as possible to report that to that particular site and say, hey, this is not good software. And if you're interested in that, I can refer you any number of sources that you can send them to give them more information about how bad MacKeeper is. So.
That's a really good discount.
Hey, hi. Regarding this case of a legitimate antivirus company grabbing personal data and etc., maybe it could be interesting if you can publish somehow the name of them,
Yeah,
because basically now in Europe we have a hard kind of legal tools to chase them and really beat them hard.
yeah.
So if it's a legit company who are doing such a bad thing, maybe publishing the name could help us to correctly go against them.
Yeah, we when it comes to that company that I mentioned that is exfiltrating user data from the App Store, we're giving them a chance to respond, but we're hoping to be able to blog about that maybe sometime next week. It depends, though. It depends on the lawyers are all over that, so it's we're being very careful about it because they are a big company. They are a competitor. We don't want to be, we don't want to get sued for one, obviously, but we also, we don't want to come off like we're, being like, these guys suck because they're a competitor. So we're being very careful about that. So if we're able to blog about it, I'm hoping we can do so soon.
What does it rhyme with?
I probably shouldn't say. I don't want to get myself or anybody else at the company in trouble. So. I might if I knew Morse code.
Do you see differences in infections based on geography?
We're not really correlating the data that way. Again, we're trying to keep a lot of this anonymous. But I'm sure that there is. I know that there is, because some of these threats, like OceanLotus, for example, are primarily targeting particular regions. So OceanLotus is primarily a Chinese threat. We don't really see that much in this country. We don't have the data to say, hey, this is found predominantly here or there. It's just sort of what we know about the malware in general. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you guys for attending.